Let's talk about guests. Guests are great, in my opinion, always recommended. So let's talk about how to find guests. Because if you are going to host your podcast as a business, you are whatever, you got to find guests. So how are you going to do that? Use your network. Use your social network. Let's go with the business analogy here.
I was just asking about this, because you are constantly interviewing, somewhat pretty important people. And this is, I'm glad we're talking about this now. So you could dive into that a little bit.
I mean, sometimes they find me, man.
And that's but see, that's the power of networking.
Yeah.
When people start finding you, it's not outbound cold calls. People are calling you, emailing you, and asking like, okay, I've seen some of your stuff.
Yeah.
How do we set this up?
Yeah, at least for Talking with Tarashuk, I have had so far 2 people ask to be on my podcast, and to me, it's the most flattering thing ever. And of course, I'm not going to say no because I know them personally, and they're great people. But how to find guests? You use your network. I used my boss. I interviewed my boss on my podcast, which was one of the weirdest things I've ever done. It was one of the most nervous I've ever been for a podcast, but it was one of my favorite episodes.
I didn't know that was your first time, in that situation.
Yeah, I've never actually interviewed someone like I worked with.
Yeah.
Michael was also an interesting one, my cousin Michael, because, he's my cousin. I never interviewed a family member. I never really had friends on my podcast. People on my podcast became my friends.
Right.
So that was a little weird. But, I found them because that's in my network. I needed someone to talk to, and I figured, okay, if this is a new podcast, I need a guest. Who is someone I want to listen to? Okay, let me target my family and friends because that's what I want to listen to my podcast.
Right.
How am I going to do that? I should get on my family and my friends. And then professionally, I use my network. You talk to coworkers.
And either way, bottom line, folks, you can't be afraid to ask.
Yeah,
you gotta leverage your warm network, so to speak, both personally and professionally. Starting off, unless you're gonna do a solo podcast and talk to yourself, this is the cost. You got to get out there and you got to network and you got to find people to talk to. Otherwise, again, solo podcast.
Yeah.
Which is cool too.
Which is also cool. But guests are great because guests, at least in theory, will be inclined to share the show with their social media following, their friends, their clients, what have you.
And it legitimizes you.
It does.
Because now someone wants to talk to you.
Mm-hmm.
In theory, anybody can get in front of the mic and talk about a particular topic, and maybe it catches on. But when you have someone else coming onto the show to talk to you about a particular topic, particular thing, career, professional, personal, it legitimizes the show, I think, on a different level.
Guests are going to help you get noticed.
Yeah.
For sure. So go to
social media factor.
Go to LinkedIn. Look for someone you want to be interested in. If you are someone who wants to interview young entrepreneurs because you're also a young entrepreneur, go on LinkedIn and type in entrepreneur. See what you can find. Connect with them, message them. Sometimes you'll get ignored. Sometimes you'll get a yes. Sometimes you'll get a no thank you. Sometimes you'll get a, hey, I'll pass, but I think you should talk to this person. You never know. Facebook groups are also great. Moxie Ann, the singer for Talking with Tarashuk, I was just looking through one of the Facebook groups I'm in, just specifically for podcast guests, where they're like, hey, there is her manager. It's like, hey, she's got a new single coming out next month, and she's looking to do press. Who wants to interview her? I was like, me. I do. So I commented on the post. I messaged him. I got his email, scheduled it, had her on, did the podcast, and she was phenomenal. I had a great time with her. She was a lot of fun. So, yeah, use social media. And also ask your guests. One thing I'll always ask my guests is like, hey, if you know someone else who would want to be a guest, connect me. Connect me with them. If I go, ooh, that's interesting, I'll talk to them. And that's pretty much my thing. Asking guests to open their network to you can be greatly beneficial.
And I'd like to kind of add one more thing.
Please.
People, don't be afraid to ask because it's no surprise. People love talking about themselves.
They do.
They love really talking about themselves. Like, oh, you're in consulting. Tell me about it. What does that entail? What do you do? People go, oh, put their feet up on the table and start telling you everything about it. people love talking about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, don't be afraid to ask somebody to do something they already want to do.
But to be fair, there is downsides to guests where it is more work, right? It is more work on you to book the guests, to schedule with the guests, having a Calendly or doing it manually via Gmail or Google Calendar or whatever, Outlook, whatever calendar you use. It can be a little time consuming. It can be a little taxing. Some guests just won't share your stuff for whatever reason. They're busy, or they didn't like the podcast, or they just don't want to. Or they'll just engage on your post. They won't make a post of their own. You can't control people. So you could have high hopes for a guest and not get the return you're looking for. That happens. Also, quality of guests. At the beginning, I was willing to talk to pretty much anybody because I didn't know what I liked. And that's advice I would give you if you're just starting. Talk to pretty much anybody. And then as you go on, become more selective. Like first talking with Tarashuk, I was like, oh, I'll talk to anybody, right? I just want to get content out there. But then it's like, all right, this particular kind of person can be very, very hit or miss. So let's say you want to do an interview show. You got a current events show or a baseball show, right? Let's do sports. You got a football show, right? And you're a diehard Cowboys fan. And you want to do a sports show, and you find a guest, and you don't know that he's, I don't know what the Cowboys, the Eagles, let's say the Eagles, they're rivals with the Eagles, and he's a diehard Eagles fan, and you're just yelling at each other for 45 minutes, right? Sometimes you got to vet your guests. So, sometimes you got to do a little bit of homework on your guests. It's a smart call to sometimes have a 10-minute call before you even schedule a podcast to see if there's chemistry there. There was one person I reached out to, was like, hey, do you want to be a guest? He's like, yeah, sure, let's do a 10-minute call. We talked for 10 minutes, and it was the most awkward 10 minutes of my life, and I passed. I was like, this would not be a good podcast.
Pre-qualify.
Yep. The problem with guests is if you have a guest, a show focused around guests, there's also pressure on you to book those guests a few weeks at a time so you don't miss a week, right? Because the main thing with podcast releases, as we're getting into is further on this course, is consistency. You want to consistently release your content. And if you don't have guests, you don't have a show. Now, there is a way out of that. But, it puts a lot more pressure on you. And sometimes the risk isn't always worth the reward. And then you got to ask a question. All right, is this guest going to be in person? Or is it going to be remote? Or are you going to do a little bit of both? In my opinion, in person is always better. I would much prefer having guests in this studio in Montclair, New Jersey, Cube Recording Studios, because I know the sound is going to be better. There's going to be less issues from a technical standpoint because I'm not the one handling it. Christian is.
Appreciate that.
I know I'm going to have a better conversation because I'm looking at them in the eye, right? We're right here, right in front of us. It's easy to get sidetracked when you're doing remote. It's kind of harder to pick up on social cues or body language. It's harder to pick up when they're done with their thought. It's harder to interrupt and move the conversation along.
Sometimes there's latency too.
Sometimes there's latency. They have bad internet.
They stop. You start talking before they stopped, or vice versa, with Zoom calls and things of the like.
Mm-hmm. So there's always issue there, technical standpoint, finding guests, but either or, you can always do both. I do both. I do a little bit of everything because I'm a mixed bag, but a podcast.